Okay, welcome everyone to the second seminar in our Beyond Inhabitation Lab Spring 2026 series. Today we have Irene Peano with us. I remind you that all our seminars are recorded and available on our website. And next week, we also have a number of international guests with us. So please look at the program and you will find Ida Danewid on Tuesday, and then Ananya Roy and Veronica Zablonski and Asha Min on Wednesday. Today's seminar is going to be chaired by my dear friend and colleague, Chiara Iacovone. Dr. Iacovone is a postdoctoral fellow here in the department and in the lab. Chiara is working as part of a project that focused on precarious housing in Eastern Europe. And she's doing a wonderful research in the city of Tirana. And today, Chiara will introduce our guest for us.
Thank you, Michele. Welcome, Irene, and welcome everyone online and offline. So I'm going to introduce briefly Irene. So Irene Peano has a PhD in social anthropology at University of Cambridge. Now she's a research fellow at the Institute of Social Science at University of Lisbon and a visiting professor at the Inter-University Department of Regional and Urban Studies and Planning here at Politecnico of Turin. Her work has focused on different aspects of the nexus between labor, especially sexual and agricultural work, and migration across Italy, Nigeria, and Eastern Europe by means of long-term engagement and solidarity as a method. So this was the introduction, and now I will leave the floor to Irene.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chiara and Michele. And thanks a lot, Michele, for, of course, making this possible today, and more generally for welcoming me here at the department and in the Beyond Inhabitation Lab. I really think that I found a sort of home, to keep with the metaphor, in working with dear colleagues and friends, and this is the second time, in fact, that I speak at a seminar organized by the lab, and I think that in many ways today marks sort of maybe the end point of a process of kind of thinking and elaboration that started with that first seminar a couple of years ago. I'm going to try and kind of not repeat myself as much as I can, but I mean, for whoever was there the other time, there might be some overlaps and hopefully some improvements as well. This is the result of long-term research that I started more than a decade ago, and that will hopefully soon become a book. And what I'm going to present today is meant as the sort of theoretical, analytical framing for this book project. So thanks again for being here. Thank you, Michele, and thank you, Malik, also, who is online as the other co-director of the Beyond Inhabitation Lab, and the person who actually introduced me to Michele in the first place. Okay, so a bit of a preface here. Agri-food currently makes for a leading source of revenue among Italy's export items, one that has not known any crisis in the last decades, but instead displayed constant growth trends like no other sector. Self-styled and paradoxically anglicized as made in Italy, food production as a whole, from farming to processing and distribution, is ostensibly and increasingly, if incoherently, anchored to locality, which itself is turned into a brand. The quality of the so-called quality of specific commodities, from pasta to canned tomatoes, to cite only the most popular worldwide, is marketed as depending on their territorial origins, often officially endorsed by means of ever-proliferating standard certifications. But of course, made in Italy products are inserted into global supply chains, not only for their distribution, sale, and consumption, but also as far as production planning and inputs, such as seeds, fertilizers, machinery, know-how, and most importantly for the current discussion, labor power. So as far as production planning and inputs are concerned. In some cases, even the raw materials, wheat, tomatoes, olives, or meat, for example, processed into commodities sold as made in Italy, are themselves foreign in origin. Likewise, at the level of policy, a growing concern with so-called food sovereignty, as you see in the slides, a concept recently hand-wrestled by nationalist right-wing politicians and now incorporated into the very title of the Agriculture Ministry, as made in Italy, also made it into the designation of the Ministry of Enterprise, formerly of Economic Development. So food sovereignty is, the idea of food sovereignty here is belied by the growing role of EU, inter and transnational, as well as multinational corporate protocols regulating agricultural commodities and their process derivatives, certified standards, labels, production, subsidies, and prices. These dispositifs supplement and in many cases even overdetermine the role of the nation state in such matters. So the Made in Italy brand may be taken, therefore, to index little more than an institutionally sponsored marketing ruse. Its reliance on a taken for granted notion of locality and stress and quality, masking the multiple forms of translocal circulation, extraction, and depletion on which it is founded. So what my work addresses some aspects of these processes, and specifically the exploitation of international migrant farm workers' labor by means of attempts to contain and control their bodies, and especially their mobility, together with the resistances by which these operations have inevitably been met and against which they keep reacting. And here I've put the slide not only to show how, I mean, the idea of made in Italy, of course, has also been employed as a trope of resistance. I mean, has been criticized by the very farm workers who actually harvest and plant these products and who are made to disappear from the label, in a sense, but also to kind of position my own research and whatever I sort of come to say today is really the product of long-term engagement with, in support of farm workers' struggles across more than a decade. So this is a tribute to their own struggles. Actually, what you're seeing here is two different instances. The top picture is about, it portrays a blockade that was that happened in the summer of 2016 outside the largest tomato processing factory in the district of in Europe that is located in the district of Foggia in northern Apulia. And the bottom picture was taken during another demonstration in the center of the city of Foggia. But the idea of, the slogan that was marked on this banner that says "Your made in Italy is dirty with our blood" was first, I think. It was first kind of, people came up with this first during a demonstration that happened in Rome in October of 2011. So it's got a kind of long history. This was just after a major revolt that took place in Rosarno in Calabria a year before, and then led to a form of self-organization by African workers who were expelled from the site of the revolt and deported to Rome, where they started this this form of organization. Anyways, back to Made in Italy. At the same time, I show how the development of the Made in Italy agri-food complex, for all its transnational remits, has contributed to an active, which is simultaneously material, effective, and symbolic process of construction of a national space and its citizenry by means of forms of differential inclusion and of outright expulsion. For these and other reasons that I elucidate throughout my work, the spatial dimension of Italian branded agri-food production, rife with conflicts and contradictions, appears salient. In fact, space making and space managing represent one of the crucial tools through which today's agri-food sector and the policies impinging upon it more or less directly organize various aspects of production, distribution, and commercialization, not least by striving to control resources such as land, water, and labor, among others. As it will become apparent, such fabrication of space has gone hand in hand with and even relied on recursive forms of wide-ranging, if incomplete, obliteration of lives and livelihoods, of subjectivities, imaginaries, relationalities, and places, in a never-ending spiral that does not quite go back to any original place, but where past experiments seem to reverberate uncannily in subsequent developments. So it is one specific dimension of this process of space making and unmaking that lies at the core of my work. From southernmost Sicily to Piedmont, here at the extreme northwestern end of Italy, an indefinite but growing number of encampments housing migrants has developed across different agroindustrial districts since the late 1980s. Predominantly hailing from across West Africa and less frequently from Northern and Eastern Africa, Eastern Europe, and South Asia, many of the dwellers of these encampments are employed in agriculture, if often temporarily, casually, and alternating with other occupations. And if this range of encampments is tied to, but never entirely subsumed under the operations of labor markets and more generally of agri-capital and supply chains, it must also be understood in relation to a complex and evolving infrastructure of migration management, enforced through multiple layers and modes of governance, at whose center today lies the military humanitarian regime that gradually came to dominate European border management. Indeed, one form of power, so capital operations, implies the other, the governance of mobility, and the encampments are one particular sort of precipitation of that kind of intersection. What you're seeing here is a picture from a report that was commissioned by the Ministry of Labour in the wake of the launching of the National Resilience Plan, PNRR. I forget what the other are. Yeah, something like that. But yes, so this is a EU kind of project injecting kind of loans and funding in the aftermath of the pandemic for a range of projects. So the Ministry of Labour decided to promote this line of funding that was supposed to lead to the overcoming of informal settlements for agricultural farm workers. We're talking about more than 200 million euros. And the report was addressing municipalities in Italy. I think about half of the total of the municipalities in this country responded to the questionnaire that was sent to them. We're talking about some 3,800, something like that. And the objects of the questionnaire were really, I mean, the questions concerned whether or not there are settlements housing migrant farm workers in any one municipality and what kinds of settlements these are. And this mapping exercise was meant as the first step to then allocate funding after the municipalities presented their projects for the housing of migrants who were then living in so-called informal settlements. So I'm posting this here not because I'm showing you this, not because I think this is any kind of faithful or kind of accurate description of what we're talking about, because as you will see, hopefully, what I'm trying to do here is to kind of portray things from a very different perspective, but to show you just exactly kind of how, in the eyes of projects of governance, I mean, these settlements should be, are categorized as being either formal or informal, and then there's municipalities where the two forms coexist, but they are, you know, nonetheless kind of kept as distinct. So, but more or less, this is the kind of the extent of the phenomenon as was returned by means of this survey in 2022. And this is the first such attempt ever made in this country. I think that they came up with a number of 150 informal, so-called informal dwellings for a population of about 10,000 workers, and a further 7,000 that was housed in formal lodgings that range from asylum seeker reception centers to labor camps, as we will see. Out of all this, then nothing came out. I mean, these over 200 million euros were, I mean, will be returned to the EU because almost none of the projects that was presented by the different municipalities who declared to have informal settlements in their territories. The majority of these projects were never approved, or were approved only too late to then be implemented. And this really gives you a sense of how, in fact, the main logic that drives the governance of these places is really that of emergency. I mean, but I might come back to this, I don't know, later. So at a first glance, encampments may be categorized as ranging along a continuum from self-constructed shanty towns to institutional labor camps and asylum seeker reception centers. But on a closer look, their formal, geographical, jurisdictional, temporal contours appear rather fuzzy. While often represented as suspended in a timeless state of permanent emergency, where, as I said, emergency is actually the kind of logic by which they are governed, frozen in an eternal present or stuck in backwardness, like many of the districts of which they are parts, made in Italy encampments are highly fluid, forever dynamic, and multifaceted hybrid places with complex histories. Their proliferation follows oscillatory non-linear trajectories. Self-constructed settlements made of wooden, plastic, asbestos, and cardboard shacks, and more of brickwork and corrugated iron structures that people who live in them, West African people living in them, call ghettos, or abandoned and then reoccupied derelict buildings, often with no facilities. These kinds of settlements may be turned into or displaced by institutionally managed container camps and tent cities, and vice versa, official camps easily become autonomous settlements by way of institutional abandonment and inhabitants' reappropriation in a seemingly perpetual process that often entails violent, if always partial, erasures. But quite apart from patterns of ruination that leave traces of past arrangements in their wake, at any one moment in time, elements of one spatial form often appear in the other, questioning the purchase of an analytics of informality. This is, again, a very kind of inadequate representation of the kind of historical trajectory of one of these settlements I'm talking about. I mean, what I'm trying to do here is actually to kind of question the sort of linear cartography that these kinds of technologies allow us to see. So again, don't take this as an analytical point, but rather kind of, to something that points to limitations. But it might also give you an idea of what I'm talking about. This is the so-called Grand Ghetto, one of the kind of longest lasting ghettos in the encampment archipelago that I'm talking about. This was possibly started around the mid-1990s in a place in the district of Foggia, where you have what you can see here is a series of farmhouses built during the 1950s agrarian reform. This was land confiscated as part of a large estate that belonged to a princess, a Neapolitan princess. The houses were never really inhabited by the people who were the recipients of the reform. They were allocated houses and land, but they lack running water, they lacked electricity. And so in the 1990s, people started to settle there for the seasonal harvest of tomatoes, so during the summer months. So the first aerial picture that I could find on Google Earth is from 2002. And you will quite clearly see how, so initially what you see is the kind of growth of some impermanent seasonal structures, and then suddenly in around 2011, 2012, the explosion. This is 2013. In 2017, there was a partial eviction enforced by the police with a large-scale operation that led to a massive fire that killed 2 people in their sleep. So a part of the ghetto was burnt down, and people were relocated to another camp in the town of San Severo, that was then kind of abandoned and became its own ghetto some years later. And then first the tent city was built that was blown out by a gale. And subsequently a container city. But as you see, then sort of the ghetto, the shantytown sprawled again around the formal camp, which is now in a state of sheer disrepair. There were massive rains some weeks, 10 days ago, and actually a person was found hanged in one of the houses there just then. Okay, so not only do institutions and third sector organizations often provide migrant ghettos with a modicum of infrastructure, as you see here, from water tanks to so-called container houses that complement rather than displace self-constructed shacks. Camps' inhabitants also tamper with rules and material structures to suit their needs and fancies. Likewise, encampments' geographical borders also fluctuate in time and space. Outlying structures of inhabitation might spring up or disappear away from their centers, and the Grand Ghetto is a case in point. I mean, you have a number of other sort of clusters of inhabitation around its main core. Some of the agrarian reform houses were destroyed by the regional government, like one of the old farmhouses that was called Washington by the people living in it, the white farmhouse. And so, you know, the contours of the ghetto are also quite fuzzy. And some of the ghettos, like this one, lie at the intersection of several municipalities' boundaries, marking their constitutively liminal character. Finally, ghetto-like spaces of inhabitation might emerge within agroindustrial town and city centers, in buildings that are not necessarily abandoned or squatted. More generally, ghettos, the actual denomination, are not necessarily self-contained, easily identified physical spaces, but always modes of being in common. Sometimes people call a ghetto a gathering of young men who make tea and kind of smoke spliffs. They're not necessarily self-contained, easily identified physical spaces, but always modes of being in common, places of access and fugitivity, undercommons in Harnian modern sense, scattered across the entire trans-Saharan migratory network from West African coasts to the English Channel along utterly non-linear routes. I mean, people do call these places along the entire trans-Saharan network ghettos. They are not and cannot be of a national space, even though they are in it. So migrant encampments' complexity obtains at the intersection of multidimensional spatial and temporal axes. Their fluid hybridity, in turn, testifies to the ways in which they result from the entanglement of what I define as multiple spatial functions that respond to disparate logics. So in some readings, the ghetto represents a place of refuge, while the camp one of institutionalized asylum or even of carcerality. Across the spectrum, as I mentioned before, in all their unique entanglements of various architectures, migrant encampments work also as reservoirs of cheap disposable labor. In this sense, they are all made of a camp function, no matter their shape. Likewise, from the refugee asylum complex to institutional labor camps peddled as the solution to rid Italy's agroindustrial enclaves of unsanitary, unruly ghettos, carceral and military qualities innervate projects of campization that straddle humanitarian and as utilitarian logics, but can at any point veer towards and arguably always already contain within them forms of what Ruth Wilson Gilmer has called organized abandonment, which, however, goes beyond the prison proper, which is what she's referring to. So encampments are interconnected in different ways. The encampments I am talking about, not only in the sense that they are made up of analogous functions and are innervated by similar logics, if in different unique combinations, but also the same people often circulate between them, whether according to the demands of seasonal labor or of other needs and interests. So in light of this, I have conceptualized this variegated set of networked living spaces as an archipelago. And of course, Michel Foucault's work on the prison is one obvious reference point for the concept, which captures the disciplinary carceral logics subtending to the range of spatial arrangements I am concerned with. Curfew hours, few if any chances to cook one's food, a ban on external visitors and on sexual, especially extramarital intimacies, the injunction not to tinker with buildings, bureaucratic barriers based on immigration and work status, poor and ever-decaying infrastructure, and multiple forms of surveillance, all ultimately premised on institutional and biocultural racisms, are the cipher of labor and asylum seeker camps, if often circumvented by what Abdulmalik Simon has called extension. So in every camp, even in the most surveilled, also lies a ghetto, and vice versa. Diminished forms of sociality, segregation, and dehumanization are never entirely absent from the horizon of even the most autonomous of shanty towns. So in its ghetto function, the encampment archipelago always displays a constitutive excess, which in Foucault's analysis was at best relegated to the role of the negative, never explored in and of itself, or seen as fully subsumed under the penal disciplinary system by way of the production of illegalities. So furthermore, it is clear that besides the disciplinary logic, so if we want to remain in the Foucauldian mold, a biopolitical and a governmental dimension that literature dealing with camp forms as abundantly, problematically highlighted is at work here. And I don't have time to kind of articulate my reading of the biopolitics of camp, which is not really the Agambenian way, but maybe we can go into that if you wish later. So this logic is concerned with migrants and workers, migrants as worker populations as much as with their individual bodies and their discipline. I don't know how much time I've got, but maybe I should speed up. In any case,
time.
Okay. So other authors have already argued, and Foucault himself already implied, that in carceral archipelagos, techniques of mobility management are also at play that cannot be reduced to mere forms of immobilization. But what I'm doing here is, instead of applying or like thinking of these techniques within the confines of a single architecture institutions, what I'm concerned with here is an induced hypermobility between different places that engenders its own spaces of transit, its corridors, and its zones. But I am also concerned, of course, there is this kind of fluctuation between hypermobility on the one hand and then forced stasis on the other hand, right? So, and of course, there is always escape, different forms of escape. So spatiotemporal suspension alternates with moments of acceleration, dispersal, and forced mobility, and so delineates dispositives of containment that, however, never quite work as intended. So so as far as the Foucauldian toolkit is concerned, of course, I am also inspired by genealogies methods, and more importantly, perhaps even by attention to the material, and especially the spatial and the architectural dimensions of power dispositives. And on the insistence, and this is something that I want to mention because it's perhaps the most overlooked aspect of Foucault's work on the prison, the insistence on the fact that the carceral archipelago and disciplinary power more broadly was born of a growing need to control the industrial labor force. But of course, while the carceral archipelago is fully the product of disciplinary techniques that emerged in the course of the 19th century, the encampment archipelago I'm concerned with results from multiple logics, temporalities, and forms of power. So in a sense, this could not be otherwise, of course, given the transformations of both agrocapitalism and the mobility regimes that subtend to it that have occurred since its dawn in the late 18th century. So in fact, analyzing the encampment archipelago for me requires first to to identify the recursions of one form of power, the disciplinary type, within another, the governmental. And of course, here I'm indebted to Anne Stoller's rendition of the work of Foucault, which examines the mutual imbrication of camp and colony as a folding of time on itself, of different temporalities, as the coexistence of multiple forms of power born of different epochs and different contexts. But secondly, for me, this is also about recognizing, again, to borrow from Abdul Malik Simon's terminology, the surrounds to such forms of containment, what lies both within and beyond their capture. So here I kind of finally come to, after I've employed the notion of recursion for a long time to think about what I'm trying to get at here. But then I was kind of also somehow dissatisfied with aspects of it. So I finally came to understand all this in terms of the notion of interference. So what I want to focus on in relation to the encampment archipelago is a temporally deep entanglement of various spatial functions that produce distinctive, singular but networked places. And of course, already if you recall the last chapter in Discipline and Punish, Foucault, when he talks about when the carceral archipelago sort of was fully kind of established, he talks about the young offenders agricultural colony of Maître, and in 1844, established in 1844, which is, an outlying structure in terms, it's not really quite a prison. And he notes that various coercive technology coexist in this agricultural colony, and specifically talks about the family, the army, the workshop, the school, and the judicial. And these coercive technologies have the purpose of training and observation. So it's power knowledge, right? And so in a sense, he's describing an entanglement of sorts that I want to develop further. And I develop it in thinking with spatial functions. And what I have in mind, and this is really, again, I apologize. This doesn't really do justice to what I want to get at. But what I'm thinking through is these ideal spaces, these spatial functions, such as the plantation, the labor camp, the military camp, the settler colony, the penal colony, and the ghetto in parallel with the slum and the maroon community. And these are pictures gathered from various sources. Some of them I took, like the top two on the left. Others are from archives or projects for kind of requalifications of ghettos past and present, penal colony, and this is a list. The list you see is a list of convicts that were leased by the King of Naples to the Marquis Nunziante, who undertook the reclamation of the plain of Gioia Tauro, where today you have a series of encampments housing migrants. We can kind of explore the images further if you want later. But so these are, the spatial functions I have in mind are really, they are not something that I they're not ideal types that I apply to analyze the genealogies of these spaces. They are actually kind of, there as sort of material, symbolic and affective remnants of today's archipelago. They are kind of, what you see if you dig in a sense. And I dig through archives, both material and written paper archives, picture archives. I dig through kind of historical accounts, but also oral histories and kind of current processes of memorialization of past experiments of these kinds. Okay. So what I'm looking at is the entanglement of spatial function, of different assemblages of power and counterpower that fold multiple temporalities in unique ways. And so I think to actually account for this sort of entanglement, the notion of interference is actually better suited than that of recursion, because I think that recursion, and more generally, and here I'm really drawing on the work of Karen Barad, who is a theoretical physicist as well as a feminist philosopher. So she's talking about interference or diffraction, which really, in her reading, are the same. I mean, and in most physicists' readings are the same phenomenon, right? So it's kind of the ways in which not only waves, but also particles combine and in their movement. So when they collide, they kind of take on new paths. And they combine in specific ways, right? So I'm interested in interference because I think that it centers the materiality of the process I'm interested in a way that does not really confine the material to the status of inert matter. I mean, these are not, so what I want to show really is how kind of past material projects, past projects of space-time mattering, to use Barad's terminology, really interfere in the present. This is not to say that what we see today is the same as what happened in the late 18th century or the 19th century, when penal colonies were being planned and sometimes established for the purposes of land reclamation, or when settler colonies were being put in place for the peasantry to avoid kind of unrest in the city centers and to kind of meet the demands for land. I mean, and this is a long history. This is a history that really stops with the agrarian reform of the 1950s, when Italy then kind of invests in terms of planning, kind of redefines itself as an industrial kind of economic power, rather than kind of being mainly an agricultural economy, relying mainly on agriculture. But I'm looking at the ways in which, I mean, very materially, I think, so where the material is the symbolic, is the affective, like all these dimensions, I mean, you cannot really disentangle these dimensions. And you really see how kind of the colonial project of primitive accumulation, that was really kind of what marked the birth and the development of agrarian capitalism in this country, also by means of external colonization, of course, I mean, of overseas colonization, was a project of racialization. It was a project that racialized landless peasants, that racialized nomadic pastoralists, especially in the central and southern regions of Italy, by sort of assimilating them to African people. So it was like anti-Black racism all along. And it was really a project for the suppression of any kind of form of revolt and class organization that, I mean, with fascism reached its apex. and you see how kind of, the echoes, again, material, affective, and symbolic echoes of these forms of racialization are never really dissipated, but they impinge upon the present. So, for example, like what you're seeing, I mean, this thing in the middle is it's an idea for the requalification of what many call the largest shanty town in Europe. That is again located in the district of Foggia, just south of the city. The shape that you see, the kind of wider shape, is that of a former military airport. I mean, to cut a very long story short, today here you have both a formal asylum seeker reception center, a migrant laborers camp, official camp, and on the side of this, like a sprawling city, but like really, I mean, a city of self-constructed houses of various kinds, but mostly like they are made of brick and mortar these days. And this project from 2022, I think, basically envisaged the construction of these living spaces on the same site for the people who live there now, who are, again, mostly from West Africa. And the person I spoke with, the person who came up with this idea, and he told me specifically that he took inspiration in thinking about the structures that he was for Inhabitation from African huts, right? What you see in the top right is a rendition of what Italian architects in the colonies, in so-called Italian East Africa in the 1930s, thought was the traditional housing type in Eastern Africa, the tukul. And the same name, tukul, was actually the one assigned to these kinds of structures that are also called pagliaia, that you see next to it, that were really the living spaces of many poor peasants, especially during the harvest season, across different parts of central and southern Italy. This picture was taken again in the 1930s in the district of Foggia during the fascist reclamation project, or bonifica integrale. That was basically aimed at getting rid of these spaces, but in fact kind of generated more of them. Again, this is a particularly interesting interference. But then, so you read accounts from the early part of the 20th century, or the latter part of the 19th century, where the tukul is actually the name assigned to these kinds of building, and especially these buildings that were kind of proliferating on the margins of the settlement of San Ferdinando in Puglia, in the plain of Gioia Tauro. That was built by convict laborers, and that also recalled, so enlisted colonists for the working of the reclaimed lands. But while the minority of people got, and this is a very kind of, again, it's a story that comes over and over in the records. So you have this kind of planned settler colony, but actually, so a very few people get a real house, which was, I mean, basically like a one-room, one-floor affair. But and the rest of them have to build their own, shacks, basically. So interference for me is really something that kind of captures the ways in which sort of different temporalities fold upon themselves in material ways. I mean, and it's a way to center materiality in a way that I don't think a Foucauldian approach really does. I mean, because it sort of takes matter as granted, whereas what I want show, to investigate, is how it's sort of it influences kind of new projects. I mean, old matter kind of comes to matter in new ways. And there is also this interesting kind of idea of positive and negative interference. No, I'm done basically, because that kind of makes recursion more complex. Because I think that so there is these two outlying spaces in what I'm talking about. On the one hand, you have the ghetto, no, which is kind of the contemporary slum, or the contemporary maroon community, if you wish, in some ways. No, it's a space of fugitivity. It's a space of excess, and the slum was always, kind of, again, the specter against which projects of resettlement were designed and sometimes implemented in contemporary Italy, in contemporary Italian history. And on the other hand, you have the settler colony that was really, I mean, from the earliest experiments at the end of the 18th century until the agrarian reform. This is a project for a house of the agrarian reform. This is what the Grand Ghetto houses looked like, more or less. Where that was really a project of reform and of kind of citizenship building, like in some cases the penal colony itself. So in some cases, the idea of an agrarian penal colony was really to reform convicts, to then kind of turn them into settlers. There were projects where the penal colony would turn into a settler colony. So the prison would cease to exist as a prison and become a settler colony. Of course, kind of, what is the boundary here between the disciplinary and the carceral, and there are shades of carcerality even in settler colonial projects of this kind. But there was always, so the idea of kind of giving land to peasants and kind of turning them into full citizens. So there was this kind of moral, redeeming sort of quality to these projects that is completely absent, of course, from contemporary projects of encampments, because here we're talking about migrants. And I mean, obviously nobody ever dreamed of giving land to migrants, but even houses, no, like that sort of spectral project that I was talking about in the beginning, the resilience project, I mean, obviously didn't materialize because, in fact, what's kind of the logic driving containment today is emergency and only emergency. But the settler colony kind of, so how does the settler colony affect, I mean, interfere with contemporary projects? I mean, it's nothing kind of so direct, but it's like the ruins of that project that interfere. Like it interferes in a negative sense, I think. No, so I find the kind of possibilities that this concept affords more productive or more generative to think with than simple recursion, that again I think is kind of still quite conceptual, whereas I'm here kind of digging specific and interconnected kinds of genealogies. I apologize, maybe this is a bit too abstract, but maybe we can kind of give it more flesh in the Q&A. I should stop here. Thank you very much.